Hi, can I test my audio real quick?
Hi, Olivia. Yeah, go ahead. I was just talking to Valerie. Sounds like she's having some technical difficulties, but
Okay.
Go ahead. I can hear you great.
Okay, good.
Hi, Eric.
Good morning. How is everyone?
Good. How are you doing? Y'all enjoying the conference so far? Did anybody get to go to any other sessions?
No, I just caught the tail end of the current session, and then I saw, the chats from the previous, all the event chats appear or archived.
Right. Yeah, there's been some really interesting discussions so far. It's been a really cool mix of people from all over.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I did get to attend some of it yesterday and watched this morning. But it's been very interesting.
Yeah, and I hope we get some good questions from our attendees today. So let's see, just trying to get all the tech figured out over here. I want to make sure. Oh, good. Hi, Heather.
Hi, I apparently forgot to share audio and video, so.
Oh, no worries. We are seeing and hearing you now, so it all works.
Awesome.
And I think we're just waiting for Valerie from El Paso. Thanks, y'all, for reviewing the presentation and everything. So I'm just going to share my screen and kind of go through the slides. Feel free to, when it's your turn to talk about your programs, just if you want to say next slide or something like that, happy to try to follow your cadence there. Any other kind of questions before we get started? And I would advise you mute yourself just for some background noise. I think Heather can kind of hear. Okay, awesome. Thanks. Yeah, that's perfect. So I'm going to do kind of the brief overview, introduce the topic of the panel, as you've seen from the presentation, and then we'll get into your content, and then we'll hopefully have most of the time for a discussion. So my overview will be pretty quick. And I think people are probably still in the other session, so I'm going to give them to ourselves here, because I'm just seeing us in the session right now. So yeah, good time to get some water or anything else you may need.
I'm not hearing Jeremy. I just saw the.
Jeremy either. It could be something. Is your browser allowing you to use your microphone, and maybe some kind of settings issue? Like if you go to that settings gear button. And now we've lost him entirely. Oh no.
In the chat, he said he was going to log back in.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's hard to. Okay. All right. Well, hopefully those technical issues will be resolved, and I think we could get started, given we're a couple minutes after the start here. So welcome, everyone. So excited to have you for this breakout session, Funding Good Food, Financing a Resilient and Equitable Central Texas Food System. My name is Carol Fraser. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm the Food Systems Program Coordinator at the City of Austin, in the Economic Development Department. I'll be moderating today's discussion and providing some context here at the beginning. And we'd love to have questions from the audience. So as we're discussing, please feel free to put those in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. So as we all know, 2020 has really been a year of reckoning on many fronts, but in particular, and most pertinent to this conference, has been the reckoning of the food system and with the food system. So among other systems, this global pandemic and subsequent economic crisis has put a spotlight on how fragile and broken and short-sighted our food supply chains are, and how they are this way, in many cases, by design. So we all know these images from earlier last year, empty shelves as people rush to stock up and stay home. There have been food shortages across the country, which have really displayed the danger of relying on just a few companies that supply most of our food. And as well, we've seen outbreaks of COVID-19 at food processing facilities, which has highlighted just how poorly we treat people who grow and prepare our food in this country. And here in the Austin region, well, simply put, most of the food that we eat comes from elsewhere. While we're generating about $4.1 billion in food-related economic activity each year in our region, only about $1.3 million of that is actually spent towards locally produced food that's sold directly to people who are eating it. And for context, the creative sector in Austin is worth about $4.35 billion. There's many, many gaps in our food system infrastructure that need to be filled in order for our region's food system to be more self-sufficient, more equitable, and more resilient to future shocks like pandemics. One major gap that we have in our local food system is the lack of publicly accessible cold storage or food warehousing. We have 0 such facilities like this. Most of the cold storage facilities that are servicing our food system are in San Antonio, Houston, Dallas, other major Texas cities. And this means that there's a really big missing link in the critical food infrastructure. We don't have as robust a food system as we should, where we could store and control most of our food supply closer to home. And our lack of food infrastructure is seen in other, even more dire ways, particularly in inequitable access to grocery stores, fresh produce, and food retail. 2020 was also the year of increased awareness and societal reckoning with the racial injustices that are at the core of our country's social and economic system. So Black Lives Matter protests highlighted the unequal treatment faced by Black and Brown people every day. And among other issues, the movement highlights the disparities in access to healthy, fresh, and affordable foods. The movement really called attention to the deeply rooted issues around food that stem from our country's social and spatial geography. So we're familiar with the redlining map. This is the one of Austin that was based on racial segregation patterns that were legally mandated under the city's own 1928 master plan. These maps and policies made it extremely difficult, if not impossible, for Black and Brown people to get mortgages for their homes and bank loans for their businesses, kept property values low, and made the areas in red that you see ripe for gentrification. So this has had ongoing effects. We can see a more contemporary map of Austin. This is from the USDA, and their definition of food deserts is the highlighted green areas. This is where low-income people live and where there are few or no grocery stores. And any method of addressing these kinds of disparities, whether it's incentivizing grocery stores in these areas or empowering community members to develop their own food retail, is going to require capital, which can be extremely hard to access or attract because of the systemic racism. When all levels of government have played a role in restricting Black and Brown people's access to capital and other resources that are necessary for having successful food businesses, Black farmers in particular, you can see them here protesting in this picture, have experienced centuries of discrimination on behalf of the federal agencies that were supposed to help them, especially the USDA. They've been denied loans and other services, and it's affected their abilities to stay in business and serve their communities. We can see how these historic and ongoing actions have shaped the current landscape. Farmers in Central Texas and our 5-county area are overwhelmingly white. This could include Hispanic and Latino people, but still overwhelmingly identifying as white. This represents not only the effects of discrimination, but also a real weakness in our food system. Diversity of experiences and approaches to agriculture, as well as serving different markets. This would make for a food system that's more responsive to the needs of the various communities that call Austin home. And this applies both in times of crisis and prosperity. Diversity is key to having a strong local food system. We have a long way to go to address these issues. And unfortunately, the pandemic is really exacerbating trends that we've seen in the differences between white household wealth and Black household wealth, which have the wedge has been getting larger since World War II. The difference between the average household wealth for white and Black families is over $100,000 at this point. The pandemic has also hit Black small businesses much harder than white-owned ones. This is for a variety of reasons, but again, partially because Black businesses tend to have fewer cash reserves and financial resources to draw upon in times of crises. Closed businesses also means lost jobs and lost revenue, and an increase in the ability for people to access safe and healthy food. So even prior to the pandemic, 15% of Travis County residents, where Austin is located, were experiencing food insecurity. This number is only going up since last year. In a land of plenty, more and more people are going hungry. We're seeing here a mega food distribution site in San Antonio. This really made waves, given how long the lines stretch on for miles and miles. And so as we rebuild from the pandemic, we have to take into account the fact that these basic needs need to be met. And finally, as we recover from the pandemic, thank goodness for vaccines for one, and we move on, we have to keep in mind that the coronavirus and the viruses like it will become more prevalent due to climate change and our current conventional agricultural practices, for example. So urbanization, intensive monoculture, agriculture, the use of fossil fuels, et cetera, are driving a future in which we'll see more pandemics. They'll happen more often, they'll kill more people, and they'll wreak even worse damage to the economy than COVID-19. This is according to the United Nations Biodiversity Panel. And this is related to food production, especially around what we call conventional agriculture. So this diagram is discussing scientifically how pathogens in the wild world come into the human one via that human wildland interface. And as we are cutting down forests for agricultural land or breeding more and more domestic livestock, we're creating more places, more bridges between the wild and the human, which allows for future pandemics to occur as more of these viruses emerge. So a key to preventing future pandemics and strengthening the future of our food system is in part a reduced reliance on this kind of industrialized agriculture, particularly involving animals who are treated with antibiotics. At the same time, locally we're experiencing a loss of farmable land and open space, so we're increasing interaction along that human-wildlife interface. We're eroding natural spaces by urbanizing them and developing them. It results in less biodiversity, less resilience within nature to fight off the kind of viruses that we're seeing. And it also results in less of our ability to feed ourselves as a region. So we need to steward and support the remaining farmland that we do have near our city. And we need to do that with sustainable agricultural practices rather than those that would make pandemics more likely. So we have many challenges to work together to solve, and that's partially where this conversation today comes out of. How do we work together to solve some of these challenges with funding and finance? We have to address the disparities in who owns, operates, and profits from food businesses. And we also have to address the unequal access to healthy, fresh, local food. And finally, we have to address the environmental degradation that threatens our health and the health of the ecosystems that we rely upon. As we rebuild and recover, we have the opportunity to reshape the food system. We have a chance to ask ourselves, what do we want our food system to look like? How do we have a just transition from an extractive economy to one that is more ecologically and socially regenerative? How do we have one that is built on the values of caring and social well-being, and that allow us to cooperate and collectively determine our future together? So these are the kinds of questions that we're thinking about moving forward. There are many different kinds of players who are interested in or currently working on food system finance, and we'll hear about different ways of being involved in this space in just a moment. There's everyone from impact investors who want to see a social or environmental return as much as a financial one. There's also community development, finance institutions who are working with low-income people and businesses. Governments and CDFIs are setting up revolving loan funds. And of course, there are tax incentive programs that could be targeted towards food systems. So there's this real landscape of possibility, real landscape of how money is flowing through or could flow through our food system. And of course, there's many different kinds of entities to fund or to finance. There's traditional corporations and small businesses, but there's also startups and entrepreneurs. And all of these different groups have different capital needs and different kind of paths on their journey as they access capital. There's also kind of alternative structures, cooperative, social enterprises, and that kind of thing that also need access to capital. So in light of all this, this context, we have some guiding questions for today's discussion. First and foremost, how do we fund transformative change in the food system? How do we address all of these issues that I've just touched upon? If we look to elsewhere, what types of food financing initiatives are already in development? And how can we adapt them to our region? We have specific context, geographic, social, cultural. Finally, what would it take for us to work together? These are really big, complex problems. What would it take to work collaboratively? And what kind of outcomes could we potentially achieve, if we're able to really leverage those collaborations? So now I'll turn to our wonderful panelists. We're going to be hearing from each of them in turn very briefly, and then we'll dive into some discussion. So we'll be hearing from Valeria Benicia of El Paso County. We'll be hearing from Heather LaPesca of the city of Dallas. Both of them will be discussing the kind of municipal and county level food related initiatives they've been working on. We'll hear from Olivia Rebanal from Capital Impact Partners, a CDFI. We'll hear from Eric DeValpine of Foodshed Investors, and finally hear from Jeremy Gregg of Arabella Advisors, and they're all working in the food finance space in a variety of ways. So first up, let's hear from Valerie Benicia.
Hi, everyone. Valerie. I serve as the Heritage Tourism Coordinator for the County Economic Development Department, which is how I met Carol a couple of summers ago. There in Austin, we have similar goals and initiatives. In 2018, in December, we adopted our Healthy Food Financing Initiative to address a lot of the issues that were just discussed in the introduction here. The overall objective of this policy is to increase public access to healthy and affordable food within areas of the county of high need. There's a website there where you can find information about the policy itself, the guidelines. There's also a map based on the Food for Every Child report that was produced through a partnership with the Paso del Norte Health Foundation. Helped us in defining as part of the policy our targeted audience, which would be low income, limited access, food deserts, as Carol, and also compounded with high incidence of diet-related disease. So the financing that has been made available to small businesses here throughout the county is based on either low interest financing through one of our community development financing institutions, namely People Fund, and then grants that the county has allocated $500,000 each fiscal year through our Economic Impact Fund. And then we work in partnership with the UT Health Houston El Paso chapter to establish, to review all of the projects that are coming in, all the proposals, and make recommendations. They provide monitoring and impact measurement, return on investment analysis, since this is one of the tools that we use in economic development in terms of our business retention and expansion efforts, of course, addressing food system issues and with job creation through those expansions. So last year, in 2020, was our first round of funding. We awarded 3 different projects. We awarded one to Desert's Food Hub. They help with increasing of local food distribution. We also partnered up with Growing with Sarah Farms. It's a legacy farm located in Socorro, one of the rural areas of the county in the Lower Valley. And they have a historic adobe property that they've retrofitted to a farmer's market stand with some cold storage access for growers that are in the area looking for a space to access customers. And then one of the neat things about the policy is it's very broad. We partnered also with Extreme Core Fitness. They provide a healthy meal subscription program, initially addressing teachers and truck drivers out in the Horizon City, another far east area of the county. Next slide, please. So with this first round of funding, we definitely felt the impacts of COVID. Desert Spoon Food Hub saw an immediate increase in the demand for their subscription program, with folks not wanting to shop in person in the grocery store. There's been quite a shift to curbside and delivery services. Growing with Sarah Farms also saw an increase in demand for access to food. They're in Socorro, and Extreme Core Fitness felt a pretty big shift with all of the different closures in schools, and really had to shift gear with access to customers as a result of COVID. We'll be beginning our second round of funding in the middle of February. The application will be open for about 6 weeks. We've added some additional requirements to the grant-funded portion of the funding, capped out at $150,000. We're asking for every applicant to go through a financial viability assessment to make sure that they'll be able to repay the loan if awarded, or that their business is not at risk of going under, especially in these times. The really great thing about our partnerships with our collaborating entities is that assistance with the financial analysis and ongoing business counseling that People Fund provides, which is critical, especially as things continue to change. And then also we ask for an owner equity injection. Does the small business have property or equipment that they own? Have they invested skin in the game, if you will? That's pretty much where we're at. We're excited to open up the application period as a means of maintaining some sustainable access to food versus emergency food relief, which can be very costly as well.
Much, Valerie. It's so great to hear about the innovative projects that you funded in the first round. I can't wait to see what next year's like. So now let's turn to Heather LaPesca from the City of Dallas.
Hi, everybody. My name is Heather. I am a manager in the Office of Economic Development. And like many cities, probably like El Paso, we have the economic development tools to support any healthy food project that we could get. So we can put in tax abatements, tax incentives, grants, TIFs. And we have funded multiple grocery store projects using these tools. But the headline that we are most known for is that we offered $3 million for a grocery store and nobody wanted our money. And so this is not what you want to be known for as a city, right? So we have to look at some other things. Next slide. So why didn't the $3 million work? And this might be a little bit hard to see, but if you look at the demographics of our food deserts versus our city as a whole, the population density is lower in our food desert areas, and the per capita income is much lower in our food desert areas. And so, you know, grocers can do high income, low density, they can do low income, high density, but it's really, really hard to overcome the market conditions of a low income and low density location. So next slide. So we needed to look at something different. And this is pretty similar, I think, actually to what El Paso is doing. But instead of going big, we looked at small community-based projects and we launched the Healthy Food Dallas initiative. And so the Healthy Food Dallas initiative is actually not a city initiative, but it's run by the Dallas Development Fund, which is a city-controlled entity that's a separate nonprofit that's funded by our New Markets tax credit proceeds. And the goal of the program is to increase the number of non-traditional food access points in low-income, underserved communities. It's really designed to be a one-time. Sorry, I have two 9-year-olds in my background, so you might see random things going on, just like an arm. But it's really designed to be a one-time capital infusion, and the sustainability is on the nonprofit to do. So we don't want to fund operating. We really wanted to fund capital projects. We have a lot of flexibility in what we were funding. We initially thought we'd get healthy corner store type projects because that's roughly what we modeled it off of, but we made it really broad and ended up getting much more creative responses than simply a healthy corner store. We can fund, bricks and mortar. We could do mobile home delivery, community gardens, water hookups, etc. We, through the first round, awarded about $360,000, which leveraged $1.4 million in total funding to 6 projects, and that ended up providing 2 million pounds of food served in the past year, 30,000 pounds of food recovered. We supported WIC farm stands, vouchers, veggie prescriptions. Almost all of the programs had some sort of education component and outreach component so that there was more community focus on that. And we awarded to Baylor Scott White, which was doing a produce stand, which uses a veggie prescription. That one's a little bit impacted by COVID because it's really hard to have a lot of farm stands at this point. St. Philip's is putting in a greenhouse to teach their students and to help they have a food pantry on site to develop more local growth for their students and for their food pantry. Catholic Charities is the picture you see on the bottom, which is this mobile market or mobile pantry that's in partnership with the North Texas Food Bank. And honestly, the vast majority of our numbers are generated by this food truck, where it's going around across locations in the city to provide food access to areas that didn't have food access previously. CFRAE is a nonprofit that is doing a seedling farm where they are creating raised beds and they're delivering them to, they have one location by a DART station right across the street from a Parkland hospital clinic. And then they're also creating these seedling farms that people can take home and do some growing in their own houses. Grow North Texas is an organization that really provides technical assistance to community gardens and runs 2 different community gardens, and they needed a cooler so that they could keep their produce fresher for their WIC food stands. And so we funded a giant cooler that 6 people can fit into and helped them with a van too. And then City Square was really focused on food recovery. And so they created a food recovery program where they took the excess food that they were getting from their community or their choice food pantry and also from their food recovery license and repurposing it into ready-to-eat meals that they're out then handing out at different locations throughout the city, including some of our homeless shelters. We are currently in round 2 right now. We got applications in December. We had 14 responses. We intend to award, our board has approved $250,000. And then actually the DRC, our regional chamber, wanted to support this initiative. And so they provided us with an additional $30,000. So we were able to leverage kind of just the initial funding source and then the additional, everybody has to put in a match for this funding. So I anticipate that our outcomes will be again close to $1.4 million of community food programs. And I think that is all I have.
Thank you so much, Heather. Well, just hearing about what you're able to leverage and do through collaboration is really inspiring, and those projects are, again, really innovative. So really excited to hear about that. Let's move on to Olivia Rebinal of Capital Impact Partners.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm glad to be here to talk a little bit about our work. Capital Impact Partners is a national nonprofit financial institution. We're a community development financial institution, so we've been referenced by Carol and others as one of the vehicles that can help to promote a more inclusive food systems. Our work is really hedging upon some very strong strategic pillars, wherein in deploying our capital and directing capacity building services to communities. We are working specifically to address systemic poverty, create equity, build healthy communities, and promote inclusive growth. And I think this comes back to something that Carol was mentioning earlier as it relates to the racial wealth gap. And lots of historic, systemic, and discrimination, in particular related to financial accessibility in communities of color that has resulted in disparities in wealth, health, and other social conditions. So we're very focused in that, on that as we do our work. These numbers reflect our work nationwide, the amounts of dollars that we've deployed in the decades of work. In Texas in specific, we have deployed almost $80 million across 22 different types of projects. Those projects reflect many of our sectors that we work in, including affordable housing, education, community development, healthcare, and of course, food systems work. Next slide, thanks. So we've talked and touched upon a little bit about collaboration and working in building inclusive food systems. Our belief and our vision in this work is that we can create economic opportunity, in particular in communities that need it most, such as those that have been historically excluded from participating in the food economy. And we can also, through this body of work, increase access to healthier food, especially in communities that have lacked it for so long. What we've learned is that to do this work in building inclusive food systems, we absolutely need to create a collaborative system and a collaboration to address collective impact and create an ecosystem of support. I'll share a little bit more about the work that we do in Michigan. We have overseen an initiative and grown it over the past 5.5 years. We call it the Michigan Good Food Fund, and we've assembled partners to help us address, to promote inclusive food systems, more inclusion within our work across the state. We have now 9 active partners that allow us to knit together a system of integrated technical and financial assistance to food entrepreneurs of color in specific. Because we have this collaborative, an array of partners, we're able to offer different kinds of financial products, ranging from microloans that are as small as $2,500 up to larger loans of in excess of $6 million. So each of our lending partners have a different product and or potentially a different geography where they specialize. And this allows us to serve a range of types of food enterprise. I think it's also important to acknowledge in food systems, and I think this is no surprise to any of us, is that the needs within the food systems are so varied. Our initiative is attempting to work across the value chain with different kinds of food enterprises, from production and growing to processing, distribution, and retailing, and all points in between. And so to be able to leverage the expertise of a variety of partners also allows us to be able to more deeply service very specific subsectors of the food system. Next slide. Through our work together in collaboration with our other 8 partners, to date, we've been able to loan $15.7 million to 35 healthy food businesses, and an additional $1.2 million to another 100 enterprises in the form of awards. Over half of them, half of the enterprises we work with are owned by people of color, and over half are led by women. 80% of them are actively supporting local sourcing, and 85% implementing at least one sustainable business practice. So these this kind of reflects the social objectives and outcomes that we're able to accomplish when we are using more collaborative process. I think that's all I have for you today. Thank you
so much, Olivia. I love hearing about Michigan Good Food Fund. And I remember learning, I think from you, that it's actually this wonderful collaborative and network. It's not necessarily, you know, its own standalone entity, but it's the result of everyone working together. I think that's a really interesting model. Thanks so much for sharing. So next we'll go to with Foodshed Investors.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me, and I'm happy to be on this panel with everyone here who's committed to collaborative efforts. Foodshed Investors focuses primarily we've recently sort of expanded across Texas. When we look at the world, we're trying to increase the supply of good, clean, fair food. We do that by provisioning advisory services. So working with entrepreneurs and small companies who may want to get capital or don't need capital but want outside advice on how to grow. We have a network of investors, so sometimes we are a source of capital. And then we have other partners where we do try and facilitate funding. So we're at the intersect of food, finance, and social good. Next slide, please. So I wanted to kind of frame us because we're tiny compared to some of the participants on this call, but it's important as we think about how all the pieces fit together. So to date, which is approximately since 2014, we've done 35 loans to 27 companies. The total capital deployed is about $3.2 million, and that includes the direct checks written by our network and those leveraged dollars that are otherwise activated. And when we look at the food space, we think in our PIC8 framework. When you start to apply impact metrics or matrices, they can be quite complicated, but we just look at people, planet, product, procurement, production, place, pace, which is the rate of growth, and plan. And our goal isn't that a company hits all notes and all metrics. It's that they are solidly in one, that it's baked into the DNA of their business and their business model, and they can focus on it and improve on it. So some examples, Cat Springs Yopon is a company out of Katy, Texas. Yopon is a shrubby, hard plant that grows in North America. It's the only source of caffeine that's native to North America. It's drought tolerant. It's how the sisters discovered that it might be interesting to explore. And as they harvest it, they try and reseed the harvest areas with native grasses, which have deep root systems, which will improve soil health and water retention over time. They're also dedicated to second chance employment. So they hit on these three metrics of product, planet, and people. What we did was provide a small loan to them that enabled them to unlock a $250,000 USDA value-added producer grant fund. So that's an example of our dollars getting leveraged through a company trying to do good things. I would have been remiss to not mention our support of the Cook Snook. I wish I could start every day with Joy. She is amazing. The Cook Snook as a business was completely dedicated to food ecosystem support here in Austin and Central Texas. I think we've seen Joy deliver on that exponentially over the last couple of years and through the crisis. They were also baked into their plan was this idea of community support, coaching businesses in the food system and helping new companies grow. We provided construction capital for that. I think they're an example that sometimes people go to banks, sometimes they're going to different sources of capital, and she saw us as mission-aligned investors. And so we were grateful that she came to us. Another kind of more programmatic opportunity that we've been working on, we've done multiple loans to farmers. The NRCS, which is the National Resource Conservation Service, has a program called Equip. It has different uses of funds across the country. In Central Texas, one of them is to put in high tunnels, which are hoop houses. They extend a growing cycle for farmers. They can increase and improve soil health just because of the process. But it's a lending, they have to implement the hoop house before they get the reimbursement. So they have to spend it up front and then they get the reimbursement. And sometimes that's an investment they don't have the capital to do. So we're happy to provide that. It's a nice, repeatable program, and it checks the boxes for the USDA too. So next slide, please. As we've been sort of encountering COVID and done deploying our capital, I think for the topic of today, I was thinking about a few things. And at some point when you start to deploy capital at scale, meaning getting towards trying to put millions of dollars into a system, real estate becomes a real dynamic. And whether that's the cost of rent to a restaurant, the loss of farmland to development, or as a source of investment, real estate and land is a dynamic. Equity loans were mentioned. Entrepreneurs often do have skin in the game. We found that a lot of times producers don't have the capital to deploy, but their skin is their blood, sweat, and tears. And so we see that as an opportunity for where we fit in the system and a gap in some of how they're evaluated. Then importantly, I think as we think about the food system and finance as a tool within it, when COVID hit, we worked with the City of Austin and the Sustainable Food Center here, and we launched a neighborhood pop-up grocery program. We were sourcing regionally sourced foods. We partnered with Common Market out of Houston. They source from regional producers. And basically, the City of Austin funded the purchase of food from the producers. And we went out to the network of restaurants and little grocers in underserved communities specifically and said, we want to give you this food, and we would like you to sell it at cost or below to your community, because what we're trying to do is increase the access of food to underserved areas. And what we discovered early on was if we didn't have a direct relationship, that pre-established trust, there's a huge gap for some people to say, you want to give me something for free and allow me to keep the benefits? It sounds too good to be true. I'm not sure I believe you. And I think that as we sort of think about resetting the food system, particularly talking about deploying capital into areas that have been historically disenfranchised geographically and communities, that establishing that trust and bringing the right participants in to have a valued conversation around that is going to be critical. And so I'll hand it off there and go to Jerry. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Eric. I think you're absolutely right. And that's definitely been one of the themes, I think, so far of this conference around how do we rebuild, and especially how do we rebuild trust. So last but not least, let's hear from Jeremy Gregg of Arabella Advisors.
Well, thanks, Carol, and thanks everybody else for all that you're contributing to this powerful conversation. It's a real honor to stand among you. So my name is Jeremy Gregg. I am honored to be the managing director for Arabella Advisors. I'm based in Dallas, here with Heather and some of the other folks in the chat. So really good to be among Dallasites here as we have this really important conversation about this opportunity. What Arabella is, and you can see on the slide, is we're basically an impact advisory firm for philanthropists and impact investors who want to amplify both their own individual impact and also who want to explore ways to work together to do things that are more powerful and more systemic, which, as we've heard from our panelists here, there's some really great innovations that are out there going on. There's quite a bit of philanthropy in the state of Texas. And what we're trying to do is to help build that infrastructure to connect those dots and allow people to collaborate. We do have a very specific good food practice that we have as a real focus point for us. And I'll offer in some of the slides that follow this some examples of what we do. But we have a real commitment to this as a firm in what we do. So here's 3 of our projects that we host on our fiscal sponsorship platform. There's the Chesapeake Food Summit, which was a gathering that we hosted of leaders in the very similar to this event today in the Chesapeake region, based in DC, and really hosting convening. So we do quite a bit of that all across the country in various areas, and we're increasingly interested in the food system. Not to put out a promo for anything, but if you are interested, our founder, Eric Kessler, and Tom Colicchio collaborated on an important Politico piece on how to crisis-proof the food system. And we believe that there's a real important role that philanthropy and impact investors can play in that role, but it's also not something they can do entirely themselves. And things like the Food Summit help us to do that. Also hosting the Farm to Fork initiative, which is an attempt to do collaborative philanthropy dedicated to advocacy issues on this topic. So we understand that the lever that we ultimately have to drive change in this system really is at the policy level, and something as significant as the food system. While you can do a lot that's really powerful via philanthropy and even impact investing, ultimately we believe there are some important policy changes that need to occur. And things like the Farm to Food Initiative, we actually host on our platform and then help facilitate. And it gives donors a vehicle to work together and to do things through that work. And then there's programs like MAFRAC, the Mid-Atlantic Food Resilience and Access Coalition, which is really looking at ways to look at the entire food system itself and look at the gaps in the market and explore what can be done in this space. And that's part of what these conversations today, why they're so valuable. Individuals are doing such powerful work in certain spaces. And sometimes what we need to do is find ways to scale and expand their work. But sometimes we also need to look at bringing a broader lens to it and doing, whether we consider it a landscape assessment or a field review, but really look at like what's going on in the state of Texas and looking at something like in the Central Texas food system, what could be done, what's working, where are the gaps, and what can be done in that space. So we host quite a few projects in that space on ours. Next slide, please. And so all that I've talked about before was really related to philanthropy, but we're increasingly interested in impact investing. And I personally am very interested, particularly in engaging philanthropists at foundations and exploring what can they do to align their investment portfolio with their grant making portfolio. Because what you might know if you're involved in the world of philanthropy is a private foundation only donates 5% of its assets per year. The other 95% is invested. So there is over $1 trillion in assets under management in the United States of America dedicated to grant-making institutions. And a huge number of that money or that mission priorities for those foundations is in the food space. What we're interested in, is there a way to harness the power of that $1 trillion to also address this challenge? And that's something that our friend Eric over at Foodshed Investors obviously has been pioneering for a long time here in Texas, and we're grateful for him and his work. The slide in front of you is one of our models. It's called Good Food Ventures. It's a private impact investing club where members pay a fee to be a member of a club. And what would they do with that is they're a part of a cohort of other people who care about the food system and want to harness the power of for-profit capital to drive change in that space. And what they receive in return for their membership is not only membership in that group and learnings and things that come from that, but we actually take their capital and we source and vet deals for them. So they're provided with about 8 different investment-ready deals that they get to review that make not only strong financial sense, but also can make a strong impact on the food system. And so it's it's an important way for them to elevate a couple of businesses. We had a call this week. We actually learned from 2 different pitches, and it creates an environment where it's sort of like the best of Shark Tank without the worst of Shark Tank. So they get to come in and everyone's friendly and they're all very committed, and we get to meet the entrepreneurs and hear about what they're doing, and they have innovative technology that does things like reduce waste, track moisture, look at ways to reduce challenges in the supply chain, all that. So yeah, we're really excited about the conversation today. Thanks again, Carol, for hosting, and thanks everybody for listening, and happy to answer any questions and participate as I can.
Thanks so much for that overview, Jeremy, and everybody else on the panel. So we have a little bit of time for a question here. And I really want to kick us off based on the theme of this conference and what got brought up in various panelist discussions. So how does racial equity fit into this work? And this is a question for everybody on the panel. Like, what are some of the ways that you found successful for addressing some of the racial disparities that we've brought up? Not only in terms of food access, but really in terms of access to capital for people of color who are starting and running food-related businesses. So please, whoever would like to take that.
I'll start. We designed this particular initiative, and as I mentioned, a lot of our work is really driven by the quest for using and leveraging our position as a capital provider to address racial wealth disparities. And so in the specific initiative and in future iterations of our work in inclusive food systems, we will center race. And we will think about the ways in which food entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs of color have been unable to access capital and capacity building services historically. And in specific, doing a lot of relationship building and engagement with our target community. There are certain neighborhoods where we are very focused because of their conditions. And we are very intentional about creating a consistent and authentic rapport with leaders and stakeholders in those communities. We're also trying to develop very customized offerings to meet the needs of entrepreneurs of color, food entrepreneurs of color in specific. So we hear from them what their gaps are in technical assistance and work with our partners to curate offerings that meet those specific needs. One example of that recently that arose was a processor that is looking to scale their pressed juicery and needing to have mentorship from another sort of expert, CPG expert of color that really understands their target audience and their customer base, and also the growth of a business owned by a person of color and the inherent barriers that one might face. There are financial considerations, and so when we do work with financial partners in this collaborative format, we're looking for those that will be able to use alternative underwriting guidelines potentially and have the flexibility to look beyond traditional financial decision-making constructs so that we can better deploy capital to food entrepreneurs of color. So race is certainly very central to our work. And so to the programs and products and services that we deploy are really focused on understanding and unpacking and dismantling some of those barriers that these entrepreneurs have historically met.
Absolutely. I think that gets into kind of the relationship building and trust that Eric, you brought up here. Happy to hear other thoughts from other panelists.
Here in El Paso, I'll share. Here in El Paso, one of our more targeted areas are obviously our rural communities. We depend very heavily on what we call promotoras from Texas A&M University, who have a very strong presence in those areas, particularly in Canutillo, in the upper valley of El Paso, and out in San Elizario and Socorro and Isleta. One of the things that I really am proud of my position from a tourism standpoint, the efforts kind of cross-pollinate, if you will, being that most of the projects that we have do provide opportunities for expansion of local food production. Our local foods are very different from what you would see in a typical grocery store, certainly compared to Central Texas. But there are a lot of indigenous foods that by nature are already very healthy and traditional in combating different diet-related disease, like for example, nopal or cactus, which is known to be very good for balancing the blood sugar, which is good for combating diabetes. So there's opportunities for voluntourism, if you will, for folks who are traveling and want to really get to know our local culture, and at the same time they can volunteer on some of the farms that are established throughout the area. So that's one way that you kind of combine the relationship building, the making sure that everything is accessible to these small businesses that are a lot of times isolated from the more metropolitan area of town, Spanish speaking. We make sure that all of our materials and all of our ongoing technical assistance or the business counseling that I mentioned earlier is made available in both English and in Spanish so that it's accessible to our population and our small businesses, particularly in the outlying areas.
Well, I love that you bring that up around. It's not only about the people who own the businesses and operate the business, also about the type of food, right? We're talking about racial equity and food access to foods that are culturally relevant and celebrating that. So that's really awesome that that's part of your initiative. And any other panelists want to respond to anything that's been said on this topic or have any thoughts to offer?
Sure.
I will
Go ahead, Eric. Oh, go ahead, Eric, and then Heather.
Okay. I was just going to say that as the food system in and of itself is incredibly complex. And then when you dive into a component, whether it's the hierarchy of food recovery or access, it's a very, very complicated system. And when we talk about really solving for socioeconomic and racial equity, I think we have to also acknowledge the historic gaps of income gaps and education, and both of those are real drivers to and access to food. But without income, limited choices. Without education, potentially not making the best dietary choices. And then exacerbated by, if the only place you can go buy food is food that is highly processed, low nutrient dense, then that's where the food system really starts to fail. But it's a gigantic topic, and there are other drivers that to successfully create a fully equitable food system, I think some of those exterior forces, income and education at least, also need to be addressed, and we can't do that in a vacuum.
And in terms of, entrepreneurship and engaging people on their business side of it, we know in our small businesses throughout Dallas that there is a huge readiness issue. And I think this has been talked about a little bit by some of the other panelists, not just in food businesses, but small businesses throughout. And so last year, prior to COVID, we had a partnership with the library where we had a 7-week series on getting your food business ready. And so there was, brought in technical providers, and everybody who was invited and everybody who was engaged had an idea for a food business, might have had a small catering company, but really wanted information on how to take that to the next step. And it was super well regarded, and then COVID hit and we couldn't really launch phase 2 of it. But that type of kind of programming that really is targeted to the food system and food businesses was, I think, really well received.
What you and Eric are bringing up here, that we're talking about finance in food businesses, but there's the technical assistance aspect. There's kind of just providing general resources that for so long many people of color have been systematically excluded from, right? So that all has to be a part of how we collaborate and how we really move the needle on these issues. I'm so glad you guys brought that up. I'd like to kind of turn to our closing question here today. I think we might get kicked out of this space. I'm not sure. It's been happening a little bit like that. So just to take it to what we're kind of calling our call to action, I think definitely myself and everyone else on this panel, we'd love to continue this conversation outside of this, whether it's at the conference or reaching out to us individually and discussing how we can work together to create better food financing options in Austin. If you're in Austin, of course, this work is happening all around the country, so elsewhere. But my final question for y'all would be, if you could wave a magic wand and change something, create something based on what we discussed today in this food financing space, what would that look like, and how would it take us to the next level? So anyone who wants to dive in for that one.
Well, I'd say my answer is similar to what I was going to share with the preceding answer about what needs to occur in the racial equity space within this, and that's that philanthropists in particular need to acknowledge that philanthropy necessarily comes from privilege, and that to enter this conversation, we have to have the humility to recognize we do not bring the right perspective necessarily to many of the challenges, and to practice what we advanced at Arabella, which is called participatory grant making, which is actually turning the money over to a committee of people who actually are directly affected by the decisions for the funding allocations, and they decide where it goes. So if I could wave a magic wand, it would be for philanthropy to have the humility to enter these conversations by engaging the people who are most affected by them and determining where the money goes.
I'd love to pick up on that. And indeed, we do promote concepts of shifting the power, in particular in financial decision making, to those that are affected the most. And in our most recent round of catalytic investment awards, we did utilize the participatory decision making process. If I were to wave a magic wand, I would ask all the stakeholders, especially those with resource, to collaborate and rally behind a collective impact that centers race within the food system, and leverage the privilege and the resource that Jeremy references. Not only that, but use that to catalyze even more capital. The CDFIs have capital, other investors have also capital that could be amassed and catalyzed together to create a more collaborative initiative that then is able to rally behind, as I said, a collective sort of vision to increase inclusion within the food economy, the regional food economy.
And I think there's sometimes a challenge between, when we're funding or we're looking at projects, there has to be a level of readiness, and it's hard to get that initial glug of capital, right? Like once you have some money, it's easier to get other money, but that entry money is hard, and it's hard for us with city related funds to invest in something that's not proven. And so we need to figure out how we can balance that, because some of the ideas that we're hearing are really great, but they just don't have the technical assistance. So how do we get everybody in a position where they're able to qualify for additional funding? And that's something I think I'm trying to figure out because it's been a challenge.
Love that. And there's lots of sources of capital, and some have constraints. Foundations often only want to give to a 501c3. CDFIs are looking for certain missions and goals. Individual philanthropists have their own personal mandate. Cities are frequently bound by their geography, counties as well. And so somewhere in there, having everyone at the table would be my magic wand to figure out how we really can work together. And in particular at that table, have the people who are disenfranchised, who are owners of the benefit that they should receive, because if they're not participants, then we're not doing it right. That would be my magic wand.
Wonderful. Thanks, y'all. And I don't know, Valerie, if you wanted to jump in, feel free.
I heard a couple of, trigger words, if you will, bringing everybody to the table. We've recently started food action roundtables where we invite both growers, retail establishment owners. We've even invited Customs and Border Patrol from a standpoint of the distribution aspect. Our region works in collaboration with a lot of growers from the state of Chihuahua and in terms of importing and exporting of food. I'm also thinking in terms of readiness. One of the issues or gaps that we've identified through those food action roundtables is also the importance of ensuring that our workforce continues. There's a lot of growers that are retiring from the industry. It's very difficult to turn a profit in the growing industry. So that's something that we're really working to partner up with our different institutions around the region, NMSU, certainly UTEP, Texas A&M, to ensure that our youth continue to stay involved in these industries, whether from the retail, direct to consumer aspect or on the production and distribution side of it. Great conversation. Thank you so much for including us. This has been very insightful, and in a way, great to hear that we're all pretty much in alignment. Here in El Paso, we're pretty far away from Central Texas, and it's very interesting to hear that we have a lot of the same issues and efforts underway.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to all of the panelists and everyone in attendance. I think this has been a really interesting conversation. I think we could keep talking for another hour, and it's unfortunate we have to cut it off here. But I think I just wanted to kind of close on the note that all of y'all touched on with your magic wand, and it would probably be my magic wand as well, is around this idea of collaboration, right? And I think overcoming what can be kind of a scarcity mindset, right? You know, I'm in my space and there's only so much money that I have to use, and I have to use it effectively. We're all used to working in these isolated silos, but really, you know, I think as got brought up in multiple ways, there is money out there in the systems. You know, our current economic system has money turning through it. So if we overcome that kind of scarcity mindset and recognize that there's actually an abundance of potential funding and financing, we just have to collaborate and not necessarily do our own thing and split it up, we'll be able to achieve something greater together. So really inspiring to hear about what's going on elsewhere. I hope that's inspiring to y'all in Central Texas as well. And again, thank you so much to everyone. Feel free to reach out. We can continue the conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks again, Carol.
Mm-hmm.